from wherever you happen to be in the country. My name is Glenn Brand, and I serve as the Vice President for Policy and Advocacy for Solar United Neighbors. And I really want to thank you for taking the time to participate in this national webinar about state action to hold monopoly utilities accountable. We hope that you will be inspired to get involved in similar efforts where you live. So that's really what I would like to see out of it. And we'll talk about specific ways you can do that and getting connected towards the end of the webinar. So first, I'd like to introduce all the panelists rather than do it right before they speak. So you'll know who's going to be presenting this evening. And then we'll, as Sarah mentioned, we'll go to Q&A, which I'll try to moderate. The first speaker will be David Pomerantz, and he is the Executive Director of the Energy and Policy Institute, which is the co-sponsoring organization with Solar United Neighbors for tonight's webinar. If you don't know about the great work EPI does, you will be after this webinar. They are the nation's leading organization at uncovering the ways that electric and gas utilities have blocked or slowed down the transition from fossil fuels to clean energy, particularly solar, from where I stand, and the ways that they have harmed communities and customers. After that, you'll hear from Maine State Senator Mike Tipping, who is serving his second term representing the 8th District in Maine, which is a bunch of communities north of Bangor in rural Maine. He chairs the legislature's Labor and Housing Committee, and he also works as research director for the Maine People's Alliance, and he has previously served as spokesperson for statewide referendum campaigns to expand senior care and raise Maine's state minimum wage. Then we'll hear from Shannon Lawn. Shannon is an attorney and vice president at the Conservation Law Foundation, where she is the Connecticut State Director. CLF, as we all know them out in the East, is a regional environmental nonprofit organization with offices in all 6 New England states. Shannon holds a JD from Harvard Law. And then our final speaker will be Danny Katz, who for the last decade has served as the executive director of the Colorado Public Interest Research Group. And he has led that organization on a variety of important issues, including sustainable transportation, campaign finance, consumer protection, waste, and public health. So with that, to set the table, I'll ask David Pomerantz to give an overview of the problem we'll be talking about and the impact of utilities using our money for lobbying and other inappropriate uses. And then again, we'll hear from the leaders of the 3 states that passed the groundbreaking utility accountability legislation this year. So with that, I'll turn it over to David.
Thank you so much, Glenn. It's such an honor and a privilege to be with you all today. So I'm Dave Pomerantz. I'm the Executive Director of the Energy and Policy Institute, and Glenn mentioned that we are a utility watchdog. We can go ahead to the first slide. Thanks, Sarah. I like to always start these presentations with a little bit of a visual. And so we've got 2 faces on the screen there. And I'll just the person on the right is a former lobbyist, and the person on the left, his name is Larry Householder. He was, until pretty recently, the Speaker of the House of Representatives of Ohio. And the reason I have these pictures up of Matt Borges and Larry Householder is both are now sitting in federal prison. And in the case of former Representative Householder, Speaker Householder, I should say, he has a sentence of the next 20 years. And the reason I use that as an example to sort of start off how I talk about utility corruption and utilities using customers' money against them is because Ohio really, in recent history, is one of the unfortunate poster children of this problem. So the largest electric utility company in Ohio is a company called First Energy. What First Energy did, they took $60 million. They routed it through a network of dark money groups to former Speaker Householder. And in exchange for that political money, he jammed through the legislature a notorious bill. It's called HB 6 or House Bill 6. And what HB6 did was it transferred over $1 billion in ratepayer-funded subsidies from FirstEnergy's customers in Ohio and other Ohioans to their utilities. That was through subsidies, really bailouts for not terribly competitive nuclear power plants, bailouts to keep coal-fired power plants online, and the bill also happened to decimate Ohio's pretty modest renewable energy and energy efficiency policies. And of that $60 million, those bribes, we know now through audits and investigations that have happened since, a lot of that money came from FirstEnergy's ratepayers in Ohio, and not only in Ohio, but even their ratepayers of other utilities they own in states like Maryland, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and New Jersey. So there's a lot of people on this phone call. If any of you live in those states and pay utility bills to a FirstEnergy subsidiary utility, there's a good chance you paid for some of this. We can go to the next slide. That Ohio example is one of the most notorious of recent years, but there are certainly a host of others. Sorry, oh, there you go, perfect. So one sort of more run-of-the-mill, banal example, but an important one, is that utilities are members of political organizations called trade associations, and they pay them to represent utilities' political agenda in Washington, D.C., and also in states around the country. So the picture here, I'm going to use as an example the American Gas Association. They are a trade association that represents the nation's investor-owned gas utilities. The picture there is of a social media influencer and the ad that she made. She was paid to make that by the American Gas Association to extol the wonderful benefits of cooking with gas. That's from the gas utilities, but the electric utilities do the same thing. They have a group organization called the Edison Electric Institute, or EEI, and EEI really prosecutes the utilities' agenda in DC and around the country, arguing for things like policies that would harm rooftop solar, which I know is important to everybody on this call, but also policies that would raise people's rates, increase the utilities' profits, and do things like they would argue against policies that would protect customers from utility disconnections. So in a host of ways, these are organizations that represent the utilities' political agendas. And we can go to the next slide. Now, it's really important to know, in principle, utilities are not supposed to charge customers for their political activities. That's sort of a long-established principle of utility regulation. But what we found, my colleagues and I at the Energy and Policy Institute, and we kind of study this stuff, that they do it anyway. So everything above the red line on this page are things that, in most cases, utilities charge their customers for. So things like all of the advocacy they do with their regulators, their public utility commissions, the trade associations that I mentioned, a whole host of different kinds of lobbying that they do of different regulators and sometimes of legislators too. And all their public relations, community relations, advertising, marketing, all those costs, those are quite often paid out of customers' bills. So when you pay your bill every month and you think you're paying for equipment to keep the lights on or to keep gas service, you're paying for those things, but you're also paying for these things, for these political costs. We can go to the next slide, which I think is my last one. Now, it doesn't have to be this way, and that's why I'm so excited in a moment to pass the mic to some folks who have done incredible work in the past year to change this. Earlier this year, my colleagues and I at EPI, we put out a report suggesting some ideas about how states policymakers could take action to stop this problem. Utilities are companies that are going to spend money on politics like all companies, but at least they shouldn't be able to take our money that we have no choice to send them, but to send them because they're monopolies. They shouldn't be able to use our money against us. There should be ways to stop that, and there are. So 3 categories of things that we identified that states could do. One is prohibitions, passing clear rules saying that utilities cannot charge, they cannot use their customers' money for these political costs, some of which I outlined. Transparency is the second one. It's really important to be able to show to regulators and the public how utilities are spending their money on politics so that those regulators can make sure that they're not charging customers for it in accordance with those rules. We also think these kinds of transparency reforms would prevent some of the worst abuses that we see utilities make in cover of darkness, like the Ohio example I gave, which was all done with dark, non-transparent money. And then the final one, which I highlighted here, is enforcement. So even if we have good, clear prohibitions and rules and good transparency reforms, those will make a big difference. But at the end of the day, there are some bad actors in the utility sector, and the FirstEnergy case is a perfect case study of this, who will knowingly break the rules anyway. And so, you know, the way I like to think of this is if a bank robber got caught in the vault of the bank, red-handed, holding big bags of money, and the police said to the bank robber, you know what, probably a good faith misunderstanding, an accident, put the money back, we trust you won't come back and do it again. I think most of us would recognize that bank robber would be back the next day, just hoping they didn't get caught the next time. And so we think it's really important that there's automatic minimum enforced penalties to deter utilities from this kind of rule breaking. So with that, I will start to wrap up. I'm very excited to pass it to Senator Tipping, who's been a leader in reforming these problems. And there are other states that are considering action too. Ohio recently introduced a bill. I know there's bills been introduced in New York in addition to the ones you're going to hear about today. So this is something that there's real momentum behind. And I'm excited for y'all to hear some more about how it's happened in a few states and some more ideas about how you can carry these ideas forward in many other states around the country. So thank you so much for having me. And with that, I will pass the mic on to Senator Tipping.
Thanks, David. And I'm Mike Tipping. I represent 27 communities in rural Maine. And I should say I'm actually in my first term, which I mentioned just so you know, I have at best an imperfect understanding of what I was doing throughout the whole process of the bill we're going to be discussing here. But just to give some context, in Maine, we have two major electric transmission utilities, which are Central Maine Power and Versant. And both are currently owned by large foreign corporations, one in Canada and one in Spain. And CMP in particular has been very involved in lobbying and politics in Maine. And for decades, you know, I've known them as the largest opponent of clean energy legislation because they didn't want the grid effects that they claimed would happen with wind and solar and things like that. They also both have a state guaranteed monopoly and a guaranteed rate of profit, as do many other utilities in other states. Recently in Maine, we've been pretty deluged in advertising paid for by these utilities. A couple of years ago, we had a referendum over a corridor that CMP wanted to build through the woods. And that ended up being this huge political fight. They ended up losing the referendum, but they're still building it anyway somehow. And they spent $54 million on that campaign alone, which broke all the records in Maine. This, you know, just a few years ago, $1 million was a lot to spend on a statewide race in the state. We have about 1.3 million people in the state. So coming up, there's even more issues and referendums that they're advocating on. There are 3 referendums next month, 2 that are around creating a consumer-owned utility and actually taking over the transmission services of CMP and Versant. And there's one that would actually ban foreign influence and foreign companies spending money in Maine elections, which is also a reaction to them. But they're also spending obviously big on those. So what really hit home for me was when my kids were watching a video on YouTube. They just wanted to watch one of their favorite Minecraft channels. And before they could, they had to watch this advertisement for, you know, a minute long for CMP. And it wasn't even about a referendum or politics. It was just about how great the company is. And to me, that's just ridiculous. My kids are, you know, 9 years old. They're not making utility decisions. They don't live in an area serviced by CMP. We live in a Versant area. And, you know, these are monopoly companies anyway. I didn't understand why they needed to advertise in the first place. So at the same time as all this is happening, we're seeing rates going up in the state for many people in my area by often hundreds of dollars a month. And from, some constituents, I heard about them having to choose between paying the power bill and buying food. Some people couldn't pay at all, and they were cut off from electricity. And so with that in mind, I submitted what became LD 325, and I got to name it an act to improve consideration of electricity rate increases. And the original intent was to ban advertising by these companies completely, or failing that, to at least 1-to-1 take it out of any future rate increases that they requested. And I still think that's a good idea. I mean, money is fungible, and in the end, it's all ratepayer dollars, even if it's coming from the profit side rather than the ratepayer side. And I see Sarah there apologizing that I don't have slides, but I don't apologize for that. That is not your fault, and also I did not want to do slides. But I do want to say the reason we didn't go that route is because there were some potential First Amendment challenges as we looked more into that. And it would have been definitely a harder road to go, but I think it's one that we should still consider. So eventually we worked with a policy analyst to write bill language that didn't go quite as far. And in the process, I learned that other legislators and advocates were working along similar lines. And so I should give a shout out to Senator Nicole Grochowski, who serves on the Energy and Utilities Committee, to groups like Our Power, Natural Resources Council of Maine, Maine Youth for Climate Justice, and the Sierra Club. And together we rewrote a bill that strengthened existing regulations and required new transparency. And that's very important. I mean, for instance, CMP, of that 54 or however much they actually spent on the corridor referendum, because they didn't even actually have to report all of it, they only reported $327,000 of that to the Public Utilities Commission under our regulations on advertising. So we wanted to both expand the entities that were covered by the regulations, which hadn't been updated since the 80s, and also expand the conduct that was covered. So the entities would now include groups that are owners or affiliated interests, as well as trade associations and other groups that they were passing money through to do some of this advertising and some of this lobbying. And what could now not be included in rates is any political contributions and spending, any lobbying or grassroots lobbying, any contributions to trade associations or chambers of commerce. And again, that was a way they were kind of getting around the lobbying regulations and the disclosure law. There's actually some amount of money they gave to the Chamber of Commerce during the corridor referendum that we still don't know how much they spent on that, because it was the Chamber of Commerce went around and did these events for them. And it also exempted educational expenditures unless they were specifically approved by the Public Utilities Commission. And these are those like very general pro-utility company ads. It also makes them all public in a very detailed way. They have to provide specific examples of the advertising that they're doing to the PUC, which they had some similar regulations like that in the past. But now that information doesn't just go to them, it goes to the public. It has to be in public reports. So even those pieces that aren't specifically lobbying in politics, that aren't disclosed in other ways, they now have to be disclosed, because I think it's important that we know what these utilities are doing with their money in general. And so that Minecraft, YouTube ad, it will finally have to be disclosed. So that bill, we had a long legislative process. We worked through the Energy and Utilities Committee, eventually passed there along party lines. It also passed in party lines in the House, but we actually got some good bipartisan support in the Senate, where it passed 25-9. And then it was signed by the governor, which is not a given. She vetoed another one of my bills. So it was good that she supported it in the end, and it'll be going into effect in November. And I know it's hard to tell when I'm done without slides, but that's...
Yeah, it's just checking. Looks like I'm next. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. Again, I'm Shannon Lawn, VP and Director of CLF Connecticut. Next slide, please. So in Connecticut, we have two big investor-owned utilities, Eversource and Avangrid. And Eversource is our state's main electricity provider. So you can see in this map, the light green is their electric service territory. And then United Illuminating, which is a subsidiary of Avangrid, provides electricity in that dark green area. And both Eversource and Avangrid also provide gas in Connecticut through their subsidiaries. Next slide. And in Connecticut, both ratepayers and policymakers really have not been too happy with our utilities. We consistently have among the highest electric rates in the continental US and an overall high energy burden, especially for low and moderate income households. And in addition, our utilities often take policy positions that are in conflict with the state's clean energy and climate goals and are generally not in ratepayers' best interests. We also have not had great electric reliability. Connecticut has a lot of trees and they tend to fall on power lines during storms. So we've had several extended storm-related outages, notably including after Tropical Storm Isaias in the summer of 2020, and that knocked out power for hundreds of thousands of Connecticut residents for multiple days. But meanwhile, while costs for Connecticut ratepayers keep on rising, our state's largest electric utility, Eversource, has had record profits during this same time period. So people have not been happy about that. Next slide, please. Luckily, we do have a very strong and effective regulator in the Connecticut Public Utilities Regulatory Authority, or PURA. That's our state PUC. This is really thanks to PURA's chair, Marissa Gillette. Our governor appointed Marissa as chair back in 2019, and he just reappointed her as chair earlier this year after the legislative session ended. And that decision to reappoint her as chair was widely seen as an endorsement of Marissa's strong regulatory approach. So under her leadership, there has really been a sea change at PURA, which used to kind of rubber stamp whatever the utilities wanted. But now there has been a significant shift in focus with attention to accountability, transparency, grid modernization, and increased opportunities for meaningful public participation. Next slide. Fortunately, up at the Capitol, our state lawmakers have been proactive in addressing concerns about the utilities. So first, in the wake of Tropical Storm Isaias, they passed what became known as the Take Back Our Grid Act in 2020. And that legislation directed PURA to move forward with performance-based regulation for the state's electric utilities. This is really a major shift away from traditional cost of service rate making and towards a new system where the utilities will be held accountable for their performance. And so far, only one state in the US has implemented full-scale PBR. So Connecticut really does have an opportunity to be a trailblazer with this. In addition, earlier this year, Connecticut lawmakers passed new legislation that includes some additional accountability and transparency measures for the utilities. And it also significantly strengthens PURA's regulatory authority. This legislation is very lengthy and complex, as 40 provisions. So since we have limited time, I'm just going to highlight a few of notable provisions here. Next slide, please. So Section 2 of this legislation prohibits rate recovery for the utilities' participation and their associated cost in rate cases. And then Section 3 does what we've been discussing tonight, which is prohibiting rate recovery for certain utility expenses. So that includes lobbying, industry associations, marketing, and certain expenses related to their boards. It also requires utilities to report on all of these expenses annually in an itemized list. Next slide, please. Section 6 of this legislation establishes certain factors that PURA needs to consider in rate-making proceedings when they determine what is a reasonable rate of return. And of those factors, they're including company compliance with state law and PURA orders, as well as the cost burden of the current and proposed rate on residential ratepayers. Section 7 also strengthens the customer notice requirements for proposed rate increases. Next slide, please. And Section 13 requires the electric distribution companies to file a monthly report that has information about any planned and unplanned electric outages that affect 250 or more people in the preceding month. And then lastly, Section 15 authorizes PURA to provide stakeholder compensation for certain groups, namely residents of environmental justice communities, hardship customers, and small businesses. So there are some guardrails that were put in place. These groups do have to meet certain requirements to qualify, and there are caps on how much the utilities would have to pay for this stakeholder compensation. So we are going to have to see how this provision actually gets implemented, but I think that having a stakeholder compensation program does have the potential to significantly increase the ability of these underrepresented groups to participate in proceedings before our utility regulator. And next slide. So what is happening now? As I mentioned earlier, our performance-based regulation dockets are now in progress at PURA. So earlier this year, PURA issued a final decision in phase 1 of that proceeding. And in that decision, they laid out key objectives for a PBR framework. And those include reliability, affordability, greenhouse gas reductions, and social equity. So we're now in phase 2 of the PBR proceeding. They have 3 related dockets, and these concern revenue adjustment mechanisms, performance incentive mechanisms, and distribution system planning. So in these current dockets, PURA is really grappling with how we implement a PBR framework and better align the electric utilities' performance with those key objectives. In August, PURA issued a final decision in United Illuminating's rate case, and they ended up authorizing a much smaller rate of return than UI had requested, and also hit the utility with some compliance fines. So UI really fought tooth and nail against that decision, and they are now challenging it in court. So we're going to see how that plays out. And hopefully the decision will stand up. Lastly, we are soon going to be moving forward with rate cases for Avangrid's 2 gas distribution companies in Connecticut. So these 2 companies just filed notices of intent, noting that they plan to ask for substantial increases. So it does look like there's going to be good reason for consumer and clean energy advocates to engage in those proceedings. That's all from Connecticut, so I'll hand it off next to Danny.
Hi, everyone. My name is Danny Katz. I'm the Executive Director of COPIRG, the Colorado Public Interest Research Group. We're a statewide advocacy group. We speak up for a safer and healthier Colorado, where everyone's freer to pursue their own individual well-being as well as the common good. Part of a nationwide network, so there are a number of other states that also have PIRGs as well. If you go to the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we won. So the things we won are very similar to what you've already heard, but we won those within a broader package. And so this is the 1-minute version of how we won. Winter bills skyrocketed. That created the political will. We were quick to point to gas, which had receptive legislators. We had a special select committee that required some sort of action or created some sort of expectation. We did a lot of storytelling and put a human face on it. and the media really fueled our narrative as well. And within all of this, we talked about the waste that comes from utilities, especially if they're spending money on lobbying and advertising and some of the things you've heard. So if you go to the next slide, that's the 1 minute version. Here's the 5 minute version. So winter bills skyrocketed. This winter, the bills went up so much. One person who testified said that when they got their bill in the winter, they thought they must have just not paid the previous month's bill because it felt like they were getting billed twice. But that was literally because their bills went up, and everybody experienced it. Everybody was talking about it. So it really did create this moment where we knew something was going to need to happen policy-wise. Something was very much expected from the public. If you go to the next slide, we were then able to quickly point to gas. So as I mentioned, this was a broader bill. It didn't just have the utility lobbying piece, but it also had pieces to try to get at some of the high costs that comes with some of utility decisions around building out a gas infrastructure. So price of gas went up by 40%. And I think our utilities here were caught flat-footed because they passed the price of fuel on to consumers dollar for dollar. And so when those go up, they're not necessarily trying to defend it. They're just saying, well, but that's not our fault. We're not making profit off of that. We're just passing that on. And so we were able to say, yeah, exactly. There's a real problem here with the decisions that have been made, given that we're now all locked into this infrastructure. So if you go to the next slide. There was this special select committee that was then called. This was a very important tool. It was unusual, and it focused in on rising utility rates. There was a panel of experts that came in during a set of meetings, including experts that testified to the waste and costs that could be borne by ratepayers if utilities are spending money on things like lobbying and other expenses. They really explored the whole utility system, and ultimately action was expected, or else there'd be some sort of egg on the face. And so we knew something was going to happen, but we didn't just assume. So if you go to the next slide, we did a lot of outside work to make sure that there was continued pressure to do something to cut waste and to move us away from these higher utility bills. You can see photos of the rallies we did and an example of a flyer that we used to get people to the Capitol to testify, to tell stories in the media. And if you go to the next slide, the media, it was a very important part of this, helping to fuel our narrative. And it was easy for them to do that because the facts, spoke very largely, which was, again, our focus was very much on the high gas prices, but that did lend itself to then looking at a bunch of different pieces. So the last slide, if you go to the last slide, you'll see what did we actually pass. We had within our kind of cut waste program a number of the things you've already heard about, limiting what ratepayer dollars can go to for lobbying and advertising. We also did a number of things around this gas component as well. So if you're interested in these, ending gas line subsidies, which cost roughly $1,000 per home, and a couple of regulatory processes will now come into line to take a look at some of the gas infrastructure decisions that utilities are making. So definitely a very good start there. So if you go to my last slide, I'll just sum up again the conclusion. In November, we weren't anticipating being able to do anything on utility reform. We took good steps to get out in front of this high gas price, which then allowed us the political power to get something passed. A lot of people experienced it, so it was definitely something that we were going to get a bunch of legislators working on. I think there's opportunities to do more bipartisan work, especially if you didn't have all of the gas components that we had in our bill. So if you're just focused on the regulatory side around how they're using their money, there's a lot of bipartisan opportunity there. But ultimately, utilities are very powerful. We have to recognize and remember that. And like anything, I think we thought maybe we could have gotten a bit more, but those utilities are very powerful. They have a lot of lobbyists. And, before this, they were spending money on that lobbying. So that's the story from Colorado, and happy to answer questions in the Q&A. I'll just put in the chat here, if anyone's interested in our main campaign website, that's the link to the website we used. If anyone's interested in that, again, a little bit more broader than just how utilities are using their ratepayer dollars on lobbying. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danny. Thank you, Senator Tipping. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Shannon. I am pleased, having followed this issue for many years, to see the breakthrough that these three states made. I think we can say, while there's been a little action before, this 2023 was the year where we sort of broke the dam on holding the utilities accountable. So thank you for your work. So let's go to the questions. There are lots and lots of questions. I will, in no particular order, I will just sort of pick a few. This was an interesting one. How do you track what utilities are doing? They're spending our money on lobbying and advertising. So I'll throw that out to either Dave or any of the panelists in their individual states, because of course the answer will be, it depends on the state.
It's a great question. Thanks for asking it. It does depend a lot on the state. One thing I'll offer at the start, which I may regret later, given there are so many people on this call, but that's very exciting, is one thing you can do is reach out to us at EPI. So you can go to energyandpolicy.org, and we have some different ways you can contact us on our website. And this is kind of our specialty to some degree, is tracking utilities, lobbying, and political operations. But I can also give kind of the short version of an answer, because I think it would be excellent if folks on this call and organizations and individuals and activists around the country, did take some of that on. There's a lot that you know surely about your own states that we don't. But the answer really depends on what kind of transparency and disclosure rules are present in any given state. And those can be sort of political and campaign finance type disclosures, which sometimes live with the Secretary of State. And they can also be specific disclosures to utility regulation. So kind of the gold standard of how to find more about a utility's expenses, just broadly, that includes their political expenses and all of their expenses, is to look in the utility's most recent rate case. That can be difficult. Some utilities are able to stay out of rate cases, not go in for a rate case for many years at a time, to avoid scrutiny. And even within the rate cases, every state, every public utility commission, every regulator is different about how much transparency they require about utilities expenditures. So it can be challenging, but there are people out there who can help. Certainly at EPI, we'd love to help if we can. There are other tools you can use as well to increase transparency of how utilities are talking to their regulators and the rest. Sun, I'm sure, can be a resource on that. And there are other great organizations that have attorneys who do a lot of this kind of work, like the Sierra Club, Earth Justice, and others who are operating in a lot of states. So don't try to go it alone, is my answer to that, as it is with many things. There are organizations, CLF is a great one if you're in New England, who might be able to help you do some sleuthing and uncover what it is that utilities are doing.
Thank you, Dave. Eddie, do you want to add, any of the other panelists want to add on this? Okay. I thought this was a really useful question. In your respective states, this is obviously to the three panelists from the individual states here, what lessons did you learn that would be useful for other people? Obviously, every political landscape in every state is a little different, but I'm wondering if you could generalize about what was the most important thing, or one of the most important things, or what to avoid. I think that's the nature of this question. So arbitrarily, I'll just start with you, Senator Tipping.
So, things went relatively well for us. So I have less hard-earned lessons of what not to do than some others may. But I do think, going into this with very open eyes is important. And there are some questions in the thread here as well about what to do in a state where Republicans have control. Right. And I do think, you have to recognize the electoral and political and lobbying power that these utilities have and that have built up for a very long time, and that they're defending, in our case, their existence and their monopoly and their profits. So I perhaps, just one thing, and I'll leave it to others to list some others, is just to recognize what you're up against and build the coalition, hopefully grassroots support, hopefully that narrative support, be talking about how this is tied, not just to broad issues and lofty ideas of transparency, but the actual rate increases that people are seeing and what it means in their lives.
Yeah. Shannon, what about in Connecticut?
I would say that constituent voices are incredibly important. So in Hartford, the utilities are always the biggest spenders on lobbying, and all too often they do get their way. But on these issues, I think, what we kept hearing from legislators is they just kept on hearing from their constituents about what are you going to do to address the affordability crisis? What are you going to do to improve reliability? How can we better hold the utilities accountable? And they just kept hearing that over and over and over again until, it really spurred them to act.
Yes, that's grassroots action. Obviously, engagement is what is going to make the difference in almost every place. Danny, what about in Colorado?
Yeah, a couple of things I'll highlight. Number one, we really leaned into the high utility bills frame. And so if you're experiencing that, that's a really good frame to lean into and creates that, political environment to do something. I think we went big and had a number of things in our bill. And as I mentioned, I think that does, limit some of the broader support you can get. I think there is a lot of potential bipartisan support and head nodding when you talk about how ridiculous it is for a utility that is monopolistic to be spending all this money in ways as if you have a choice to shop around. So I think there is a downside for going big, but going big also allowed that piece of the bill to be pretty uncontroversial. And there were other things that really focused attention. So that piece really, I think, flew through more easily. So depending on your political climate and what's going on, you can go our route or not. There's pluses and minuses to that.
Yes, thank you. There's been a lot of questions about specific provisions in these bills. And rather than go through, is something or other in the bill, I thought I'd maybe go back to Dave and ask what he thinks are the essential pieces of a strong state utility accountability bill. With the limited, not the lengthy, but what are the 4 or 5 most important things that need to be in the bill? And of course, Dave, I'm hoping you'll mention the model bill that we helped put together that has that language. But what do you think? What are the essential pieces?
Yeah, I will start with that. In fact, thanks, Glenn. So I believe it's in the chat. Solar United Neighbors has a great resource on this. It's a model bill. So it's kind of a template, and we worked with them on that. And I think the goal there was to take a lot of, what some of the advocates working on this think are the most important, most effective pieces of this that have been in some of these different states, Colorado, Connecticut, Maine, even some pieces from bills from other states that haven't necessarily passed yet, or federal legislation that's been introduced, and sort of put them all together in one so that can be some of the best practices. So I'd encourage everybody to check that out. It's a template, of course. It won't be exactly appropriate in that form for every state, and legislators will need to make their own choices about what's right for their state, but it gives some best practices. To summarize that, though, in terms of what's in there, I think for the prohibitions, for the outlining of what utilities can't charge customers for, the devil's really in the details there. Have to be specific. If you ask utilities now, they will say they do not charge customers for lobbying, but they get around that by sort of creating definitions of lobbying that are probably not the definition that many of you on the phone would think of, right? So like if the utility goes and talks to a legislator and they say, we want to educate you about rooftop solar. We think it's really bad and it's dangerous and all these other things that aren't necessarily true, but they don't say, vote yes or vote no on SB1. that might not fall under the state's definition of lobbying. Some states have definitions of lobbying that don't include regulatory advocacy. So getting the devil, I just say on those prohibitions, the devil is really in the details, and it's important to get those right. Transparency, we've talked about a lot. And then I'll just reiterate what I said about enforcement. I think it's really important that there's penalties, right? So that if a utility you do establish good rules and a utility breaks them, there has to be a deterrent from that. So they can't just, not follow the law with impunity. And the final thing I'll mention, because I've seen it pop up a lot in the chat and the Q&A, is people have been asking a little bit like, okay, this is good if utilities can't use our, directly charge customers for this in our bills, but if they can still use their profits to lobby and give to candidates and all that stuff, what about that? What can we do about that? And that is difficult. As people have noted, we have a campaign finance system in this country that's very permissive for companies to be able to spend on political speech. So it can be difficult to just kind of outright ban that. But there are some things that can happen. I saw there was a question about disclosure of certain kinds of, traditionally dark money spending or 501c4 spending. That probably is possible under Citizens United. Some of that is kind of, I think, a next stage of this. So it might not be reflected in that model bill that I mentioned, but that is something that a lot of us are thinking about, is even if a state can't stop a company like Eversource or CMP or Versant or any of these utilities from spending their profits on political contributions, we can at least prevent them from doing it in secret. That is possible. And so just as one example, there was a settlement in a proceeding in Michigan where the Attorney General's office in Michigan, they deserve a lot of credit for this, pushed hard and got the utility to agree that they would disclose all of their 501c4 contributions annually, which is a way that Michigan utilities have spent a lot of dark money politically. So I think that's a next step that a lot of policymakers might consider. Once you make it really, really illegal, clearly illegal for utilities to spend their customers' money on politics, now let's make it illegal for them to spend their profits secretly. At least we can do that, and then we can, see where things go from there.
Thank you, David. I thought this was an interesting question. I think we all assume we know the answer, but what was the major argument that the utilities in your states make to oppose the bills? Danny, what did they say?
So as I said before, this was part of a much broader bill around, trying to reduce the amount of investments that are going into gas and helping to get folks off of the, reliance for gas for heat, which was really, which exposes us to these huge price increases. So there was very little arguments against the components that we're focusing on today, or at least publicly there were. And so again, could be a benefit of this strategy. It's just that it's a lot harder to target that when there's something else out there. For the gas pieces, it was, traditional arguments of that, this is going to either cost consumers or make the grid unreliable, or, there's no evidence that this is the way we should go, those sort of things.
Right. And Shannon, in Connecticut, what did Eversource say?
Yeah, similarly in Connecticut, I mean, they've made a lot of claims saying that, increasing accountability is going to cripple them financially. They've also been really aggressive in personal attacks against our chair at our Public Utilities Commission, who I mentioned earlier, because she has taken a very strong and aggressive stance towards the utilities. So yeah, it's kind of devolved into an ugly battle with them making statements about her and the regulators and claiming that, these increased accountability measures are going to be like putting them out of business, and that the regulatory climate in Connecticut is like the least favorable of any state that they operate in, and that sort of thing. So that's kind of the tack that they've taken on all of this.
Yeah. And Senator Tipping, did Central Maine Power say this is going to raise your rates or something like that?
No, I think Similarly, both Versant and CMP actually testified neither for nor against
Great.
the bill. I think just because it is such a powerful message. We're just talking about transparency and not using your money on political ads. But they did, through the process, try and oppose it by bringing up a lot of technical objections. They tried to weaken it, so it's impossible to track what we're spending through trade associations and lobby groups. So, and that's part of our core product anyway, and we should be able to pay for that with your money. They also argued that, we're already transparent because we already have a Public Utilities Commission here. We already have an Ethics Commission that oversees campaign spending. So we really don't need to be more transparent.
Got it. We're already doing it. Got it. Interesting. There were a lot of questions about the political landscape and this effort. I think it's clear, of course, we're talking about relatively moderate or more liberal states, politically speaking, the ones that are represented here. And there's a lot of questions about, well, what do you do with states that have Republican supermajorities where legislative action is currently virtually impossible? Is there another way to do this other than through the legislature? A lot of assumptions in that question, but I think it's really an important question. I'm wondering what you all would say to that. Danny, I think you raised your hand.
Yeah, I'm happy to address that. In Colorado, we're seeing the same. We're seeing groups across the political spectrum using the high utility bills as a messaging and as a frame. And so I think no matter where you are in the country, if there's any sort of pressure on those utility bills, upward pressure on those utility bills, I think that is a frame that you can use and connect with legislators on all sides, and present this as, this is something that, again, is we heard plenty of testimony from, in this case, Republican legislators, because we had a democratically controlled legislature in Colorado, plenty of Republican legislators who joked and brought up, like, it's ridiculous that I see these utility advertisements when I go to our basketball game or whatever. I'm just concerned about these other pieces of the bill. So again, I think I'm still a believer that this can fit well in that saving people money. The last thing we should be doing when bills are going up is allowing this kind of waste. And so I think you can lean into that and find a legislator, cast a wide net and find a legislator who has had that personal experience, because I'm sure there's a few who have.
Great. I think Senator Tipping, you had your hand up as well. Mike, can you hear me?
Sorry, my internet may be freezing a bit here. So I just wanted to say that, again, I think this is a very strong issue for public messaging. Just the idea of people voting to keep utility spending secret and to use your money for lobbying and political ads, that's very easy to message around. And I think that's why we saw, there were a couple of votes in the Senate, and we picked up Republicans each time and got more support. So, I think people realize that, it's an issue that if you can force a vote on it, maybe you can help make people at least think about that.
Great.
We also had bipartisan support for the legislation in Connecticut.
That's great. Great. All right, I think we have time just for one quick question, and then we'll wrap it up. But there is we're talking about state action here, but there is a bill that was introduced in the U.S. Congress on utility accountability by Representative Castor out of Florida. And so the question is, will that take care of the state problem? Is it the same? Dave, I think you know most about that.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's called the Ethics in Energy Act, and the link's in the chat. It would be great. It would not, unfortunately, absolve states of the opportunity and, I would say, obligation to act on this. So that bill is, sorry, it gets a little wonky fast, but that bill is specific to rates for wholesale electric transmission, which are regulated by federal agency FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Retail rates electric retail rates are still regulated by state public utility commissions. So we kind of need to do all of these things.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I just want to wrap things up. I want to thank the panelists. Really interesting experience to hear about. Also want to thank everybody for taking time out in their evening and their afternoon to engage on this. And we hope, as I said at the start, the webinar will energize you to take similar action in your state. Please reach out to Solar United Neighbors, and we can help you get involved in the right people in your respective states. Or if there's nothing going on in your state and you want to organize something, let us know and we can help. The best way to do that is to contact us at advocacy@solarunitedneighbors.org. I also want to mention something that we didn't mention in the beginning. I want to thank the Energy News Network. This was an online valuable newsletter that helped promote this webinar. And just can't thank everyone enough for taking the time to address this really important issue. Thanks again.
Thanks.